Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am about to go to bed, but I thought I might squeeze in another episode because I've been going pretty much daily since the beginning, and today was a crazy day. So I am going to squeeze in a short one. Hope you're all having a good weekend. I know it might not be the weekend when you see this, but it's Saturday for me. Crazy day. My kids all had soccer and birthday parties, and my husband happened to be out of town, so it was a little hectic for me. Anyways, let's do this. This chapter is called First Summer. For Bobby's children, especially the teenage boys, the death of their beloved father had been devastating, a near mortal wound. Excuse me. Reeling from the blow, they began acting out their anger and frustration in a way that caused terrible dissension with their mother. Ethel, too, had sustained unfathomable emotional wounds. As with the boys, her anger and frustration were also seeking release. In the immediate aftermath, she began taking out her rage on her sons, the most readily available targets. Once, when Joe hit little Carrie, Ethel forced him to walk up and down the stairs dozens of times. A week after the funeral, David celebrated his 13th birthday at a grim Hickory Hill party, during which his brother Bobby spiked everyone's milk with a laxative. Oh my goodness. Bobby Jr. and David constantly got on their mother's nerves, and she began ordering them out of the house. "Just leave home, get out of my life," she would scream. On one occasion, when little Christopher fell at poolside and began to cry, Ethel's rage overflowed on him as well. "On your feet, you know how to behave." "Now get out there and show some class," she bellowed. Now it doesn't say how old he is at this time, and I don't know, but that's kind of sad. Show some class. Friends of the Kennedy children who visited them said they were fearful of Ethel and tried to avoid her as much as possible. Fractious, turbulent, unsettled, enraged by a private pain barely under control, Ethel and her brood arrived at the Cape to spend the summer 16 days after Bobby was shot. Accompanied by a Secret Service agent, Courtney and Carrie, and the dogs Brummus and Freckles, Ethel flew from Washington to Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. With her small entourage, she passed anonymously through the airport, bustling at the moment with photographers and Hollywood and New York celebrities arriving in town for a wedding. I feel like my head's getting cut off, guys. Sorry. At the Harborview Hotel, she met up with a large contingent of the family: Joan, Jackie, Pat, and Jean, with all of their children. Ethel led the group to St. Elizabeth's Church, hoping to take communion, but the curate, Father George Almeida, not expecting such a large crowd, ran out of consecrated bread and had to send to nearby Oak Bluffs for a new supply. To the priest's embarrassment, Ethel got tired of waiting and convinced the others to leave and receive communion later. For weeks afterward, the priest, who had never met the Kennedys, feared that Ethel would complain and that he'd get a call from the Pope himself for allowing such a thing to happen with the world's most famous widow. Oh my goodness, she instilled that kind of fear in people. I think the Kennedys instilled that kind of fear in people. Maybe not just Ethel. They didn't want to anger them. That's kind of funny. Back at the hotel, Ethel went to the front desk and requested a pink heating blanket. "We didn't have any," recalled Bill Thompson, a Maryland college student who was working at the hotel for the summer. "So we dashed somebody into town who ran around and finally found one heating blanket and brought it back. It was the wrong color, and she was very upset." Now that's kind of silly. If you're cold and you want an electric blanket, you take what you can get, in my opinion. But you hear kind of stories about celebrities having their little demand lists too. Maybe Ethel was one of the, front runners to that whole way of thinking. The next morning, after attending Mass, Ethel returned to her room, where Thompson happened to be changing the bed linen. Years later, Thompson, who had become a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun, was still shocked by her curious behavior. She unlocked the door, walked in, looked at me, but didn't say anything. She went over to her bed and proceeded to undress, down to her black underwear. I can't say I stood there and stared at her. I continued to do my work, but we were in the same room, and she was down to her bra and slip. It struck me as something somewhat memorable. I just figured that she had grown up having staff and that I was just another invisible person. Probably. After leaving Ethel's room, Thompson was assigned to clean Ted's, where he found the floor and tables littered with lots of empty cocktail glasses. They must have had a party the night before. In one of the Kennedy bathrooms, he also found an incredible mess. The tub was filled with long dog hairs where they had bathed Brumus. Oh my goodness. As the Kennedys were walking to the dock to board the chartered 60-foot yawl Mira, Ted realized he had forgotten a jacket with his eyeglasses. Thompson, who was helping them with their luggage, ran back to the hotel and found the jacket lying over a railing. I ran down and handed it to him, and he didn't even look at me or say thanks. The help was simply invisible to them. They left a 10 or 15% gratuity on top of their hotel bill. Well, that's new, because earlier on in the book they said that they were, not good tippers. I mean, I don't know if that's a good tip, but it's a tip nonetheless. With Ted at the helm, the Mira began the 20-mile trip across Nantucket Sound to Hyannisport. For most of the cruise, Ethel stayed on the stern, sunning herself in a white swimsuit. At one point, Ethel became angry with Bobby and David and took action. Directing them below deck, she proceeded to beat them with a hairbrush, the first time they'd ever been punished in such a way. So the cracks are showing with Ethel. I mean, they had to sometime. It's horrific, but she wasn't quite as put together as she liked to put out there, it seems. When the boat docked, Ethel told them once again to leave home. This time they complied. Bobby Jr. spent most of the summer in Africa with Lem Billings. And David went to a tennis and ski camp in Austria with his cousin Chris Lawford. David later claimed he was seduced at the camp by a 17-year-old girl who went after him after she found out he was a Kennedy. Those Kennedy men, apparently there's something about them. Ethel's Hickory Hill staff had traveled north by car, bringing a ton of luggage, half a dozen horses and ponies, and many of the children's pets. Bob Galland, who had driven to the Cape in one of Ethel's cars, crammed with her things, hoped the summer would ease the pain he knew she was suffering. She was haggard, tired, and ready for some calm, he recalled. At Hyannis, the mood was tense, as Ethel issued multiple orders and directives, ranting if the staff didn't carry them out quickly. Shortly after arriving, she fired her longtime horse groom on the grounds that he wasn't working hard enough. Fearing for their own jobs, the rest of the help kept a low profile. Ethel's days and nights that first summer without Bobby rarely varied. She awakened early, went to Mass at St. Francis Xavier Church with some of the children, and was out in the yard by 10, phoning friends or writing letters. If a pen ran out of ink, she dispatched a member of the staff to go into town for half a dozen of her favorite $25 gold-plated crosses. When her stationery supply became thin, black-bordered lettered paper and brightly colored memo pads with Ethel spelled out in bold lowercase letters, she'd have her secretary place a rush overnight order with an exclusive Madison Avenue stationer whose other clients ranged from Richard Nixon to Playboy Porfirio Rubirosa. One of her notes, written during that period, received national attention when it was read by Coretta King to the thousands on hand for the Poor People's March in Washington. She also had correspondence with the president. In the moments after your terrible loss, Johnson wrote, world leaders sent many messages of condolence. It occurred to me that you and the children might like to have this volume, which contains those expressions of loss and sympathy. All have been acknowledged. Oh, that's kind of nice. Nice of him to do that. Ethel responded with a note of thanks on her black-bordered stationery. Most afternoons, Ethel went sailing with children and friends, taking along an enormous basket of turkey, chicken, roast beef, milk, fruit, cookies, pie. What wasn't eaten was tossed away. She'd return home at sundown to bathe and dress for dinner. There were always guests because she refused to eat alone. She even rented a small house outside of the compound for friends to use when they dropped by, and many came. Priests and nuns were among the most frequent visitors, just as they had been at Lake Avenue in the old days. They came to offer comfort, and Ethel enjoyed their presence. Her brother Rushton also arrived, but he stayed on his boat, not in the compound. Ethel appreciated his interest, but tended to avoid him. She's always gravitated more toward the Kennedys than her own family, remember that. There was a lot of drinking on Rush's boat, recalled one staffer. Beer all afternoon, and as soon as he tied up at the dock, whiskey. There was a lot of sitting around and fooling around. The usual Hickory Hill crowd was ever present. The Glens, the Stevenses, the Evanses, the Buchwalds, and Andy Williams. Ethel's mood swung drastically. One moment she'd appear to be blue, the next cheerful and ready for a party. On one occasion, neighbors telephoned for the police because music was blaring from the compound. When officers arrived, they found that Ethel herself was the culprit. Despite being in the 6th month of pregnancy, Ethel was still eager to compete on the tennis courts. On one occasion, when she and Jim Whittaker were beaten by Buchwald and Williams, Ethel was livid, falling to the court and banging her head on the surface in frustration. Okay, she is coming unhinged a bit, it seems. She demanded a rematch and the next morning smashed the ball into Buchwald's cheek before he had a chance to lift his racket. Oh my goodness. She's ruthless. She and Whittaker took the set 6-0. I am guessing they let her win because they didn't want to deal with her craziness. Oh my Lord. Williams, whose 7-year marriage to Claudine Longuette had begun to crumble, was a frequent guest at the compound that summer. Doing an engagement at a Boston summer theater, he was picked up by one of Ethel's drivers after each evening show, brought back to the house, and returned to the theater the following afternoon. Andy was there more than anybody else, and he did stay in her house, Bob Gallen said. The singer was not one of the more popular guests, at least in the eyes of the help. I wonder if he was a bad, messy guest or something. Oh no, here we find out. He treated us with disdain, said Galland. He would talk through you or around you, which didn't seem to bother Ethel, but made us feel badly. I know the kids didn't particularly like him either. He didn't have anything he could share or do with them, and he didn't go out of his way to. He was just there to see Ethel. Another frequent visitor was Robert Burks, the New York sculptor who had been commissioned to do a bronze bust of Bobby for display at the Justice Department and needed Ethel's approval of the proper likeness before he could cast it. Burks had previously created a famous bronze bust of Jack Kennedy. Ethel rejected one design after another, which Burks had based on hundreds of photographs that he'd bring with him to the house. The tension between the two was high. Ethel didn't like the nose or didn't like the hair. It became quite humorous after a while, revealed a friend. Ethel and Burks finally came to an agreement, and the bust of Bobby was unveiled in January 1969. At the end of the summer, the older boys returned to the compound, their behavior not noticeably improved. Well, how could it be? Nobody's really addressed the actual underlying issues and just ship them away and hope everything's going to be better when they return. That's usually not the way things work, especially when you've had such a huge trauma, and that's one of the major things that's being overlooked. One afternoon, David and Bobby got together with some friends, and the discussion, as it often did in those days, turned to drugs. Bobby, admitting that he'd given LSD to his parakeet, urged David to try mescaline. David was soon hallucinating, the drugs peeling away the thin veneer of control. "You're dying," he screamed at his brother hysterically, "just like Daddy." Now, I believe he was absolutely haunted by seeing his father shot. There's no two ways about it. Later, for the first time since Los Angeles, David made an awkward attempt to talk about his father's death with his mother. She refused to look at him. "It's not a subject I want to discuss," Ethel said firmly, pushing past him. He would not bring it up again. Now, there's a documentary out there done by Rory Kennedy on Ethel Kennedy. I've referenced it once before. It's interesting. You can find it on YouTube. It's very, very biased. If I was doing a documentary on my mother, I'd probably be quite biased as well. But even then, when they tried to bring up Bobby's death, and this was, not that long ago, she was a much older woman. She's like, "I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about that. Can we talk about something else?" I wonder if she ever talked about it with anybody. It really doesn't seem like it, unless just with her children, but it doesn't seem like that is a subject she would. It's like she put it in a little compartment in her brain and that was it. That's my assessment of it anyways. Okay, that was chapter 92. Those poor kids, you just feel for them. And then, yeah, Ethel and her unhinged behavior, her crazy competitiveness, that's nothing new, but getting down and banging your head on the court, that seems a little, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if she would have received anyone's help or advice, but you would think with all the resources and influence and money they had, that they could get pretty much any, mental health counselor or something there. But it didn't seem like that happened. Maybe she wouldn't have taken it if they did. It's hard to say. All right, let's go on to chapter 93. It's called Money Matters. While Ethel vacationed, there was growing speculation about her future, where she would live, and on how much. The truth was that Bobby had not left her as wealthy as many thought. While his estate totaled $1.6 million, more than half that amount was already earmarked for debts and expenses. In the end, Ethel was left a relatively modest $358,000, with each of the children receiving $17,000. Not included in the gross estate was a Hyannisport house, lot, and furnishings valued at $111.5 thousand. Wow, talk about inflation, right? Because that was a nice place, $111,000. Ethel and the children also shared in various trusts set up by Bobby and his parents, but those funds had been established to be doled out over time and were not easily accessible. After George Skakel Sr. and Big Ann had died 13 years earlier, Ethel's share of their estate remained tied up in stock and trusts too. While she received regular dividends from her Great Lakes carbon stock, the annual amounts were modest. Ethel needed to face the cold reality of cutting back on the extravagant lifestyle to which she had become so accustomed. Still, by most standards, she was well off. You'd have to be very well off to care for all that property, but as well as all those kiddos. We all know how expensive that can be, especially if they're all in private schools and that kind of thing. But on the advice of Steve Smith, who would keep close tabs on Ethel's financial situation and would eventually come down hard on her, Ethel filed a petition in mid-August in Manhattan's surrogate court for permission to sell the New York apartment, which was in Bobby's name and worth an estimated $150,000. Cited in the petition as a reason for seeking court approval of the sale was a currently favorable market for the apartment. Rumors immediately flew that Ethel was planning to sell Hickory Hill too. NBC reported that she had decided to leave McLean and return to Greenwich, where the network said she had bought a 20-room, 64-acre English Tudor estate with a guest cottage and stables for $1.5 million. So I guess people really did think she had more than she did. But I think even still, you think the Kennedys are super duper rich, and probably a lot of that money has run out. The rumors had started in McLean when Ethel had the names Hickory Hill and Kennedy removed from the big white mailbox to protect her privacy. A similar rumor started in Greenwich, where the Skakels initially declined to deny that Ethel was the mystery buyer of the Tudor estate. The New York Times immediately jumped on the story with a lengthy feature on the beautiful homes of Greenwich and the rationale behind the report that Ethel had bought one. But Hickory Hill had become as much a part of Ethel's identity and persona as the Kennedy name, both of which she had pledged she would never surrender, and her children felt the same way about the house. Shortly after the funeral, they had held a family conference of their own at the dining room table and ruled out living in New York and Massachusetts. Not knowing their mother's plans, Kathleen and Joe decided to speak for their sisters and brothers and tell Ethel they wanted to remain at Hickory Hill. To their relief, there was no argument. Hickory Hill will always be our home, especially with Uncle Ted living nearby. This is where we will stay, Ethel told them. Ethel was angered by the erroneous news reports and instructed Ted's office to issue a public denial, saying that she had not looked at any property, has not bought any, and will not buy any. Ethel's sister Anne said at the time, "Why should Ethel go back to Greenwich? It's like Thomas Wolfe says, you know." Unlike the New York apartment, Hickory Hill had been deeded as a gift to Ethel in January 1965 by Joe and Rose. Ethel owned the place outright, her most valuable asset next to her chunk of Great Lakes carbon stock. While Hickory Hill would never go back on the block, Ethel's financial advisors saw another way, in addition to the sale of the New York apartment, to generate money for her. They dusted off an unpublished magazine article written by Bobby a year earlier and shrewdly offered it for sale. In April 1967, Bobby had been commissioned by the New York Times Magazine to write a several thousand-word piece about the Cuban Missile Crisis, to be published in the issue of October 22, 1967, which marked the 5th anniversary of Jack's announcement that Soviet missile sites were being built in Cuba. In late August 1967, Bobby's office told the Times that he had already written about 5,000 words and was only half finished. In October, after repeated inquiries about delivery of the piece, Frank Mankiewicz informed the Times that the senator was reluctant to release the story, now 25,000 words, because it might look like he was using inside information to advance himself for the 1968 presidential nomination. The Times capitulated and the piece never ran. After Bobby's death, Ethel found the unedited article, which had been forgotten, among his effects. About the same time, editors from the New York Times Magazine coincidentally approached Bobby's people, once again to see if the story could finally be published. Seeing the renewed interest, the Kennedy money people put it on the block, touching off a strenuous bidding war that did not include the Times Magazine, the ones who had commissioned him to do it initially. But that angered some people. The major selling point, of course, was Bobby's ultimate insider status. He'd kept detailed notes on the crisis and had put never-before-revealed material in the manuscript, including correspondence between Jack and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The key marketer for the piece for the Kennedy family was Ted Sorensen, who had served as a special assistant to Jack and was currently both the attorney for Bobby's estate executors, Ethel, Ted, and Pat, and an editor-at-large of Saturday Review, a magazine owned by the McCall Corporation. Within days, McCall's toppled all the other bidders. The final selling price, a cool $1 million, the highest amount ever paid at the time for a manuscript of that length. The deal also gave the Kennedy estate approval of advertising copy, excerpts for serialization, and photographs. McCall's won all rights, including book publishing, serialization, films, and television. The article, with some editing by Sorensen, ran in the November 1968 issue of McCall's. After the book rights were sold, Ethel got actively involved in the production of 13 Days. She even chose the actual paper stock the publisher used and vetoed some of the advertising because it focused more on Bobby's role in the crisis than on Jack's. Editors at the Times Magazine were furious at the Kennedys' actions. After all, it had been the Times' idea to have Bobby do the piece in the first place. The magazine had even supplied him with an outline. But as one editor involved in the project noted years later, this was no time for us to raise a ruckus. The Times didn't want to be accused of widow bashing. But what the Kennedys did was, well, pretty sleazy. Well, that's not the first time we've seen that behavior that could be described that way, is it? Probably not the last, I dare say. Sorensen maintained after the sale that it was the duty of the executors to maximize the estate, particularly when there are 11 minor children. So I can see that side of it too, absolutely. I mean, in the end, if there was some kind of contract breach, like legally, then they would have been able to pursue that, but there must not have been. So, you know, if I was Ethel, I probably, you know, that's a lot of children to raise and a lifestyle to maintain, I guess. So I guess I may have done the same thing. But is it sleazy? Probably. Did the Times deserve it? Probably. But I mean, did they deserve to get the manuscript? I think so. Especially they provided him with an outline. But I guess if it wasn't written in stone somewhere, then all's fair in love and war and all that good stuff, right? All right, guys, I am going to go to bed. I am going to put this out tonight, I think. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Happy Saturday. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do one tomorrow. I will do my best. But Yeah, we're getting there. We're plugging along and about 2/3 of the way through. So hope you guys have a lovely evening, lovely morning, or whatever it is where you're at. All right, y'all take care. Bye-bye.